and a very warm welcome back to the DAL Global Virtual Summit, leading, winning and well-being and inclusion in response to COVID-19. For those who've just joined us from over the pond in the States, good morning to you and good afternoon to those who are in the UK and in wider Europe. Delighted to welcome our fourth panel of the day, winning hearts and minds through diversity, inclusion and belonging, and ensuring this remains core to all levels of business and wider society. We're joined by three seasoned diversity, inclusion and belonging cultural leaders who I'm excited to welcome to the DAL Global virtual stage. Sarah Churchman, Chief Inclusion, Community and Wellbeing Officer at PwC, Karina Govindji, Director of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, EMEA at Google, and Emily Heath, Diversity and Inclusion Lead at Verizon Media and One Young World Ambassador. We're going to be discussing with our diverse and inclusive leaders in global businesses about why now is not the time to put diversity, inclusion and belonging on hold, and the potential consequences if we did. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of this session, we would love to hear some personal introductions into your backgrounds and any insights into why you're also very passionate about diversity, inclusion and belonging. Karina, I'm going to come to you first.
Great, thank you so much, Leila. Thank you for having me here today and for DAL to be able to host a fantastic event like this. So I'm Karina Govindji. I currently lead diversity, equity and inclusion across Google's EMEA region, that's Europe, Middle East and Africa. And prior to joining Google about 10 months ago, previously I was the global diversity lead for Vodafone. So that was across sort of 30 countries that Vodafone led. And prior to that, my experience has been in consulting, where actually I was applying diversity through an engagement lens. So I've had an interest and sort of passion in this area from as early as going to university and really understanding the social psychology behind why we have inequality. So very pleased to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you ever so much, Karina. Sarah.
Thank you, Leila. So, my name is Sarah Churchman and I lead on diversity and inclusion alongside employee wellbeing and mental health and all of our community engagement work here at PwC. It's a role I've had combined with a variety of responsibilities, really, but D&I has been part of my remit for the last 20 years. And if you like, I was the founding mother of the agenda at PwC, which grew out of a big piece of work that I led back in, believe it or not, the late 90s. I know it's hard to believe, but looking at work-life balance issues in professional services. And really, it was out of our inability, really, to accommodate people who wanted to work flexibly, and look at us all now, that our business case for diversity originally originated. It's important to me, I'm very passionate about it because I think it just goes to the heart of my values and what I prioritise outside of work as well as within work. And there must be also the influence of having a son and a daughter who, you know, I've invested equally the amount of money and love in both of them and want them both to be successful in whatever they do in life. So yeah, very passionate and feel quite privileged really to have a job in which I'm allowed to pursue my passion every day.
Thanks ever so much, Sarah. And the lovely Emily.
Hi everyone, it's Emily Heath. I'm a diversity and inclusion manager at Verizon Media. I predominantly cover the EMEA region, but one of my main passions and global focus is our employee resource group. So I'm very proud to have led that now for 4 years globally with 5,500 members globally across, that's over half the population of our employee base is actually in our employee resource groups. So very proud of that and the commitment they've made to diversifying our business as well. For me, it started, obviously have an American accent, born in Indiana, went to Chicago at the age of 4 and came to London at the age of 9. So for me, it's always kind of been about the people and the culture that we have. Diversity for me started at a very young age, from Southside Chicago to being in a very predominantly white area in Indiana to what does that mean now in the UK and how we focus on that and the difference of cultures that actually create the space for conversation as well. So it's actually started for me at a very young age. So very happy to be here, Layla. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists today. Clearly, there are longer-term sustainable opportunities in learning, given the present environment versus what has perhaps previously been this short-sighted game that some companies would have formatively adopted. Now, how can we ensure that diversity, inclusion, and belonging continues to receive the support that it really does need? Sarah?
Well, I think it's so important that it does for all the reasons we've kind of obviously outlined already in terms of our passion. But I think there's always the risk, and we've learned from previous crises, that there's always the risk that organisations do put this onto the back burner or deprioritise it when there are obviously so many present issues that businesses will be focused on. But, you know, I think I would hope that we can learn from previous crises and the downside of doing that, because I think if you just think about why organisations have prioritised inclusion and diversity in the past, the value that it brings, the commercial opportunity that it brings, those things aren't going to go away, nor are they going to be diminished in the future. So I think it's about organisations really thinking hard about why they prioritised diversity and inclusion in the first place. Why do they need an inclusive culture? And if they have a strong and robust and well understood business case, it should therefore not fall off the agenda. But I do think what we will see is, I guess, a different approach depending on where different organisations were at. Were they leaders or trying to lead in this space, or were they laggards trying to catch up and maybe hadn't quite convinced themselves of the commercial imperative of creating the right culture in which diverse talent can thrive? But if you think about the world we will become, the new normal or the next normal or whatever we're going to call it, you know, what we do know is you can't go back in time. So the past is the past, and the future is going to be something quite different. And to take on difference, you know, head on, in a kind of confident way, what we know is we're going to need very different kinds of people with very different kinds of skill sets and experiences, because that's what creates good decision making, right? Robust decision making. That's what leads to innovation. And we're all going to have to reimagine what we do in a world that's going to be very different going forward. So I think it's going to be a test for organisations as to how committed were they, and how strong was their real commercial case for diversity, or was it more about the optics or the window dressing and a little bit about corporate reputation? So I think we might see a variety of approaches, winners and losers.
Fascinating. And again, I absolutely concur. I think those that perhaps have paid lip service, I dare say, to diversity and inclusion and belonging, and of course, welfare, health and wellness, perhaps will find themselves falling a little bit short given the present circumstances and the fact that actually everything's online these days, so we can see what is happening. People talk. So Karina, I wonder, you know, your thoughts on this. What are you seeing personally, and of course at Google?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and lovely to see you again. You know, like Sarah said, actually, I mean, I think we're already starting to see. I saw some emerging research that said, you know, over a quarter of D&I leaders are already saying that, you know, the activities are either stalled or on hold, you know, indefinitely due to COVID. So I think, you know, like Sarah said, it will depend on the stage that organisations are at. But you know, the reality is we all know this is a long-term game, but one that we have to keep at, and we have to keep making it business relevant. And I think, you know, where you know, organisations make it business relevant, they're much more likely to be in that long-term game. And so, you know, even sort of bringing in experience of the COVID, you know, what does that mean for inclusion, and making it really relevant to businesses, making it part of leaders' agendas ongoing, and making them responsible, and integrating it into people processes, so it doesn't rely on, you know, this separate unit to create D&I, but actually it's part of everyone's jobs.
Absolutely. And Emily, your thoughts, and of course at Verizon Media.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, you know, Sarah and Karina both touched on some very valuable points there too, and embedding it into the organization. I think organizations, you know, it's easy to have a strong mission and some values and some goals from the top down, but it's really about the people at the end of the day. So how are you making people part of that strategy? And I think that's what we're seeing right now in terms of that longer term. If you are built people into your strategy at the heart of your organization, then actually you're going to be winning right now, right? Because you're in a time of crisis, but you've already built that foundation of it being employees first. You know, I think it's also a multifaceted approach, as we've all said. You know, it doesn't just start with D&I, you have to embed it in the organization. So making sure it's part of the business, making sure it's part of your product, building your product. What is the end consumer going to see at the end of the day? You know, so it's also building for the world and that we live in and that we represent, and making sure that those products are diverse for your consumers. And again, that goes down to people. You can have all the awareness training in the world from unconscious bias training, but it's not that solved. So again, you know, long term, how is that kind of learner's journey and that continuous learning path that you take people through on that awareness? Maybe foundational unconscious bias training is the place to start. What's that plus? What are the courageous conversations, the allyship programs that you put in place to champion individuals? And again, going back to people being at the heart of the business.
Indeed, and it's a really valid point, because diversity and inclusion, contrary to some that believe this is a pink and fluffy agenda, it absolutely is not. Those like yourselves who are leading practitioners in the field know that this is an absolutely relentless task. You know, diversity, inclusion and belonging is mile wide and mile deep. You know, not only, as you said there, Emily, you know, is it important to have that buy-in from the top and from those C-suite leaders, but it is something that we need to be looking at embedding right from the bottom, right from those grassroots level, and then horizontally right across the organisation.
Well, that probably leads nicely, Leila, into the next question, which I'd like to address to Karina. Is D&I seen as business critical, or does it still need to justify itself?
Thank you. Well, I think we are way beyond D&I having to justify itself. And I think, you know, this idea of sort of discussing the business case or, you know, justifying should we or shouldn't we, I just don't think that's an option anymore. And those, you know, that are still having that debate are going to be left behind. I think the progress that we have made, you know, on representation, albeit slow, albeit not enough, has happened because businesses have moved beyond trying to, you know, justify whether or not we should be doing this, but moving on to action and trying to find solutions. But for that progress to be, you know, accelerated or even sustained, you know, we absolutely have to go with that point of view. And I did, you know, see the McKinsey sort of most recent research about, you know, is diversity, does it still matter? And, you know, again, you know, we come back to the qualities that characterize, you know, diverse organizations. So innovation and resilience, you know, even more than ever, we need those right now as we go through this crisis. And, you know, if we think about, you know, not just business critical, but critical, you know, I'm sure everyone's seen some of the, you know, research, you know, for example, by Caroline Perez, you know, in Invisible Women, where, you know, we're talking about actually it's not just business critical, it's critical to lives to have diverse points of view at the table. So, you know, women, you know, 47% more likely to die, you know, in a car crash because cars aren't designed, you know, with women in mind, or more likely to suffer from heart attacks because their symptoms aren't the same as men's. You know, I think we have to accept that actually, you know, D&I is not just business critical, it's really critical to life.
Good. No, I mean, I fully agree with your remarks there, Karina. I mean, it's interesting you speak about organisations that are going to get, you know, left behind in this. I mean, the theme of this conference is about, you know, winners and leaders, and I think we're listeners, you know, who are tuning in today. That's what they want to hear about. You know, they don't want to hear about the organisations that are going to be left behind. People want to be part of successful organisations that are going to lead through the pandemic and beyond. And I'm sure, Susan, you must see that with the clients that you have at PwC. I mean, it would be interesting to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What's really interesting is, so I'm based in the UK, and in the UK we have something called the gender pay gap regulations that have been in play now for a couple of years. But the government have kind of, if you like, lifted the requirement for organisations to report currently, The great news is that you think, therefore, that, you know, companies might say, phew, thank goodness I haven't got to report, so I can go backwards, you know, on my gender pay gap. Actually, what we're seeing working with our clients is that the majority of them still want to go ahead, and despite the fact they are not required to report, they are still wanting to report, so they are still focused on this agenda. So I think it's really encouraging to see. And I think what's really helpful during this crisis, if there is good to come out of it, is the fact that, you know, often I think inadvertently D&I gets deprioritized because people forget about it. You know, it's still not necessarily front of mind or built into people's core, and we still need the nudging, the so-called behavioral nudging, the prompting of people to bear it in mind, to think about it when they're doing this, when they're recruiting, or whatever they might be doing. I think what's been really interesting is in the media, all the reporting we've seen about how this crisis has either impacted certain groups differently, depending on, you know, their heritage, for example, or I love the observation how those territories, those countries that have dealt with the crisis best, just happen to have female leaders. So all these nudges, I think, are really helpful so that we all keep it front and centre stage.
Oh, very good. And Emily, Verizon, obviously we heard from Ramses earlier, but it'd be good to hear your perspective. Yeah, so
you know, unfortunately, I think there are some businesses that are still justifying it. You know, luckily I'm part of one that doesn't. But it's important to understand that diversity and inclusion is critical more now than ever. Just some of the points that you said, Sarah, about the stats and the statistics we're hearing in the media. You know, the fact that the Asian communities are facing more discrimination now than ever. So, you know, how do we truly move that needle? I think we have to be more intentional and deliberate about what we're trying to do within our organizations. Again, not just fluffy things that people might think or the nice to haves. It's like, how do you bring that conversation to light? It's listening to individuals as well. You know, I think I'm very fortunate to be part of Verizon Media, you know, who hasn't stopped their agenda for D&I right now. In fact, more than ever, we're leveraging our employee resource groups to have those conversations, giving them the platform to open the door for their membership, but also their communities, to really have the conversation about why it's still important more now than ever. And as we're moving to this new workforce of the future, or whatever that's going to look like, how are we ensuring that we take this opportunity to say, okay, how do we make it, you know, our workplaces, or whether that's, you know, what that's going to be like for parents, for those with disabilities. You know, now we have the chance to hire in a different way that we never saw before as well. So making sure that we take those opportunities to really do that. And again, I think the buy-in that we've seen from Verizon Media is, you know, from CEO Hans Vestberg to our own guru in Verizon Media, daily conversations, you know, from them, and again, weekly conversations with our employee resource groups. So the fact that they're putting those people first and taking the time, and D&I efforts and budgets haven't stopped for us, you know. So I think that's also, you see that value when you're still being asked to take a voice at the table, especially when it comes to things like workplace of the future.
Thank you so much.
I think as long as we continue to have the conversations and don't let them go away, you know, if we just stop having the conversations, and okay, if at first somebody maybe say no, we don't have the budget now, budgets are on hold, then if we just forget it and don't go back to it, you know, then we've wasted all the effort. I mean, I really think we've got to keep on, pushing until we get the right answer. You know, we heard in the previous panel about mental health and well-being, and diversity and inclusion, and is it part of that, or is it something separate? Well, we should be talking about both, and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about both and keep pushing the agenda right to the top.
Absolutely, some really good points there. And as Karina mentioned before in the McKinsey report, now is absolutely not the time to put diversity and inclusion on hold. In fact, quite the polar opposite, this is the time to really place this at the forefront. And I truly believe that businesses will be remembered for this when we are finally out of the COVID situation, which we all know now is highly unlikely to be a V shape, more like an elongated L shape. But Emily, thanks for sharing that piece there. And obviously, myself and the DAL Global team, very lucky that we get to work closely and know Verizon Media very well. But I know that you guys have done some brilliant things, including having helplines, which really 24-hour helplines. I used to work for the Samaritans for 3 years, and it was tough going to keep a helpline open for 24 hours. And the fact that organizations and Verizon have actually got that facility available on hand to their global workforce, that's absolute, I put my hands up, that is something to be commended. And segueing nicely into the next question that I have, and it's for you actually again, Emily, to lead, and again, love thoughts from our other panelists, Sarah and Karina, but how can we build this real significant level of organizational empathy across all levels of the business? Because we did mention before, this is multifaceted. It's not just one segment of the organization that is responsible. It is all. So how can we build that level of empathy across the board?
Yeah, thank you. And I think again it goes back to the listening platforms and creating those conversations. But sometimes it's as simple as holding up that mirror and saying, okay, we all at a baseline understand what it feels like to be excluded, whether that's from a classroom or a sports team to a meeting, or not having that conversation or being brought in when you think your voice could be very valuable. So sometimes it just takes to have that reminder that we all have that feeling of exclusion, and that doesn't feel very good. So sometimes it's having that mirror, but we also have to accept that we're also different. The experiences that we have are very different. So, how do we learn from each other and open those conversations? In essence, it's our differences that are our superpower. So also like saying, that, having that different view to a team, or inviting someone that you've never worked with before into a team meeting to almost open those doors, and leading by example really help. And again, going back to the point that we really can't ignore the situations that are going on now. So as much good is happening in terms of connecting individuals, there's some really horrific things that are happening right now in our world that we've seen, from Minneapolis to Alabama to the Asian community's discrimination they're facing. So I think it's also the fact that there's people of color that are being affected right now at a higher rate. So how do we have that platform to have those conversations, for us to listen and learn from how people are feeling? Just yesterday in our team meeting, we started off just with the conversation about how is everyone feeling about some of the things that they've seen in the news. That allowed me to learn things about my colleagues that I hadn't learned before, and then create empathy for those communities that they're representing. So I think it's creating those forums for employees and leaders, because you want leaders in those conversations too, to listen and learn from one another.
Many thanks, Emily. And Karina, what are your thoughts? Because I know that you're a champion of culture and inclusivity, and would love to hear how this is stretching across the board within your organisation and some of the experiences that you've had perhaps previously. Because I know that you and Sarah have worked together before, which is great.
We have, and I think just to maybe just to build on what Emily shared, I think this idea of formalising that listening and those experiences is super helpful. So I'm a sort of allyship is really key to sort of building that empathy. And I think where we can find ways as organisations to encourage that, to recognise that, to formalise that, I think that really helps, rather than just leaving it up to individuals to do that. And the idea of allyship is to support those in marginalised groups where you don't necessarily identify with them. And on Google specifically, that does centre on the challenges surfaced by these underrepresented groups, and then developing that kind of consciousness, that compassion and that humility as an ally. That might not be my experience, but how can I step in those shoes? And I think the reality is everyone can practice allyship, but I think we need to be much more purposeful as organizations about how we help that to happen.
Absolutely. And when you say stepping into people's shoes there, that is so critical and very difficult to achieve unless we are sharing, listening, learning, and, you know, storytelling in particular, absolutely key to being able to almost look through the lens and a window of someone else. But Sarah, your thoughts?
Well, I absolutely agree with what Emily and Karina have said. And I think actually the current situation whereby we are, in my organisation, we have across the globe, you know, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people now able to work from home, and not every organisation can do that. But we're all meeting, we're continuing to connect and meet, and those meetings take us into each other's homes. And I think this is a great way of actually supporting our leaders to become more inclusive, support all our people to become more inclusive, because all the assumptions that we may have made about people and their background and their circumstances are being blown away. I think it's very difficult. This ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes is quite hard. It sounds easy, but it is quite hard. It's much easier if you can actually see into other people's lives, their lives outside of work. So we've got so many different scenarios, but you've got the family of 4 in a 5 or 6 bedroom house, and you've got the family of 20 in a 2 bedroom house, but they're coming together to meet and really seeing what life in someone else's shoes is like. So I think there's a real opportunity. You can tell that I'm an optimist, or a cup or a wine glass, hopefully half full person, looking at every cloud has a silver lining, and there will be things that come from this that we can take away, and they were an opportunity to move us forward. But I think we've just celebrated Mental Health Awareness Week in the UK, and the theme of that week was kindness. And kindness, compassion, empathy, these are all the skills of an inclusive leader. And we know our leaders need to be inclusive going forward, because it's the humanity we bring to work that's going to differentiate us when we're all more reliant on technology and tools, etc., that leverage technology in the digital world.
Indeed. And I think where, we've shared so many throughout even just the beginning of this day, lots and lots of positive stories. And whilst it is obviously a challenging time, what's been really heartwarming to see is that everyone seems to be looking at this with the glass half full lens on and saying, look, it's been a challenging time. It is a challenging time, and we still have more times to come ahead that will be difficult for all. But there's always a silver lining in the cloud that we should pay attention to and make sure that we harness that in order to keep us and bring us all together, frankly.
Yeah. So Sarah, do you think that inclusive business leaders need to place more value than ever in minority and underrepresented groups?
I think they need to place equal value on everybody. And I think, whether it's more value or equal value, I think it's going to be different from perhaps where we've come from in the past. And I think the experience of literally being able to put themselves into other shoes, to enable them to dismiss some of maybe the assumptions they make about others. This is what's so important. This is why inclusion is so important, and developing the capability, the emotional intelligence amongst our leaders is so important. But absolutely, they need to place equal value on everybody. It's a bit like our philosophy towards social mobility, which is not a protected characteristic under UK legislation, for example. But I think everybody believes that where you've come from should not determine what you attain or where you get to in the future. And I think that's kind of an aspect of diversity that everybody buys into, because we do have a lot of senior people in my own organisation and across the business world, individuals running organisations, and they've come from very, very socially disadvantaged backgrounds, and they've managed to excel, succeed, and somebody put value on them at some point in their career. Somebody sponsored them, championed them, and enabled them to become what they are today. And that's what we need of all of our leaders, irrespective of the background of an individual or where they come from in this world.
Oh, very good. Karina? What?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've shared today how COVID has highlighted that inclusion matters more than ever before, and when you're in a remote working situation, that needs to be more conscious to make sure that biases don't play out even more. If we think about for example the fact that children are home and if we play into stereotypes that, you know, it's mothers who, you know, take on that role, you know, all of this can, you know, if we're not careful, we really need to be clued into some of these potential impacts and be very purposeful about the impact. And, you know, the reality is the data is showing us that our underrepresented groups are disproportionately impacted by COVID. So you take in the UK, you know, I think it's something like, you know, 14 to 15% BAME in the population, yet there's 17% plus who are dying of COVID. So these are real facts that actually is, I think, our responsibility to draw attention to leaders on that. I mean, the other area is domestic violence. And, you know, if we look at the increase in that, you know, how do we help managers and leaders know how to pick up those cues when you're working remotely? You know, if you see someone on video, you know, conference, how might you be able to tell, how might you be able to support them? So I think there is a need to lean in more in this time to our underrepresented groups, to be listening, to be sort of, you know, understanding, and like Sarah said, not to be making assumptions.
Very good.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it is disproportionate. Sorry, Campbell, to interrupt you.
No,
I was just saying, absolutely, it is. I mean, it's so saddening. I know we did touch on this in one of the previous panels, but heartbreaking to see. And again, I don't just single out the BAME communities, but it's also, as you said there, Karina, key that we do pay attention to what the data is telling us, because it is, you know, like you said, that 13%, I think it is in the UK, specifically, who are BAME. Yet it's a third that are being affected on the front line as those within NHS and kind of health workers, which just seems absolutely disproportionate. And so, you know, you're absolutely, you know, both right there. You know, it's our moral responsibility as human beings to be able to be looking after these others so that we can all go forward on an equal and stable footing. Sorry to interrupt there, Emily.
No. Are you seeing anything particularly across the EMEA group, Emily?
Yeah, so I think, again, looking at it from, you know, Sarah, I think you brought to a great point there that, you know, it's just not one, but it's looking at the wider group, because again, right now, you know, even getting on video calls for some people is very difficult, being in this virtual world, and also, you know, people being alone. So, you know, we talk about families and everything, but there's some people that have literally not seen someone for weeks, months, you know, and they're completely isolated in their home without that connection, and how that plays on people's mental health, you know. So I think it's kind of looking at it more now than ever. And yes, we know there's a huge disparity in terms of workforce populations, you know, in terms of talent and how we see that represented in our workforces. So how do we prepare for whatever that new normal is going to be? So how do we take this time now to refocus our hiring efforts, work with our talent teams, our HRBPs, to say, you know, how do we prepare for when we do open the doors of hiring again in a different way? How do we take this time to provide those foundations that maybe we're always moving so fast to do? You know, it's always like, you know, you want to hire yesterday or 3 weeks ago, and you know, the person not in right now. So I think it's taking that time that you have to, you know, this downtime to make sure your processes are right and there's certain things in place. So that you can prepare for that whatever that new normal is going to be. But again, it goes back to actually something that Ram said about products and consumers too. It's like, how are we building these products, these processes for the world that we live in? And whether that's also just saying, you know, for our parents or for those that are neurodivergent and again are not comfortable getting on certain screens or using certain technologies, making them accessible. So I think it's looking at the full gamut of underrepresented groups at this time, and just how we can support them through this, and then furthermore, whatever that new normal is going to look like.
Absolutely, and I think it's that holistic viewpoint that you've all mentioned there, is when we look at diversity, inclusion and belonging, instead of kind of looking at it as that one-dimensional, you know, purely gender or purely BAME. Actually, there's so many eclectic pieces that represent that diverse and that kind of that rich smorgasbord of diversity and inclusion, you know, be it visible diversities through to invisible diversities in addition.
There's a question from Tim, and he's saying, is there a level at which D&I stops?
in addition to what Tim's saying is, look, is there a level at which D&I stops? It's led from the top, understood and lived at the bottom, treated with suspicion in the middle, which again, I'm not saying agree or disagree with that necessarily, but it's a very interesting statement there. So as Campbell said, kind of any thoughts on that, hopefully give you a little longer to consider.
I think someone once told me that we would be out of a role in D&I when the question stopped. Whatever that looked like, but the questions of what is D&I, what are employee resource groups, what is this about, what's the business case, when those questions stop, and let's be honest, they haven't stopped since this was created, and Sarah being a pioneer in this and where we've gone to now, yes, things have changed, things have developed, but there's still these conversations happening, there's still these questions, so that doesn't directly answer that, but I think which stops is when there aren't any questions, when we all have a baseline, we all understand what diversity is, we're all inclusive, and we see more representation as well.
And this is where you need diversity. This is why you need diversity, you see, because I'm interpreting that question in a slightly different way. I'm wondering whether it means more about the hierarchy in an organisation, and does it stop when it gets to a certain level? And I think so. Just to build on what Emily is saying, I think it means it requires different interventions depending on different roles in the organisation. And I think the role of the D&I practitioner or the inclusion practitioner in the organisation is to ensure there's the element of all the work that we're doing around culture, but then it's about helping everybody to understand what their responsibilities are in this space, because they will be different depending on an individual's role. So I think it's breaking it down. Certainly one of the things that I've done in my own organisation is to say there are so many things that we could do to advance this agenda, and because there are so many, you risk not doing any because it's overwhelming. It's a bit like, if you've got 35 priorities, which you can't possibly do 35 things at the same time. So it's about identifying what are the key things that key stakeholders need to do to ensure that collectively we move the organisation forward. And I think that's absolutely fundamental. So we're not all doing the same things, we're doing those things that within our role and remit will have the most impact.
Very good. Another question that's in there from Kirsty, I think's best initially addressed to you, Sarah, would be, do you think equality will be reached in the gender pay gap?
That's an interesting one. I think there's so much confusion as to what the gender pay gap is, and most organisations, having done detailed analysis, would be quite confident in saying publicly that they're not paying unfairly to one group over another, women versus men, but the gap is driven by underrepresentation of women at the very top. So then that begs the question, are we ever going to get sort of 50-50 and therefore completely equal pay? The optimism comes through again. I think that has to be possible. I think what is often the driver of a gap within an organisation is the functional responsibilities that people have. So are there certain functions or professions that women are attracted to that just, is it because they're attracted to them more than men that they pay less, or what's going on there? But, you could argue that, is HR as a profession paid less than finance, for example? So you've got kind of the job segregation challenge there. But I think, one of the things that we do as an organisation is a huge amount of outreach activity, going into schools, reaching people at the, students at the youngest possible age, to try and dispense with the idea that there are jobs for boys and there are jobs for girls. Actually, you can be anything you want to be if you set your mind to it. And so hopefully by starting at a very early age, we will overcome what have been quite demarcated female and male roles and jobs.
I mean, I think give credit where it's due. I was reading the report on Unilever recently, and they just reached gender equality. 51% women, 49% male, which is fantastic. But it maybe goes back to the point about D&Is were work ever finished, because they might tick that's been achieved now, but what's next? So gender pay equality. So how long is it going to take us to get with gender pay equality? And these things don't change overnight. And if there's a commitment over the longer term period, and that's where you're going to go, then we will get there. I mean, I share your positivity, Sarah, but I mean, it's not going to happen overnight.
Correct, unfortunately.
Sorry, Karina.
Yeah, no, I was just going to build on that actually and say, I think it is that commitment. So I think, the question's asking, of course we can't force people into higher or lower level jobs, but companies that set ambitions, that drive towards those ambitions, and that's why that representation at the top is so critical.
Yeah,
absolutely. And
Leila,
just another final question here before we wrap up. And again, for those that are inside the summit, don't worry, our panelists are staying for the networking break, so you can ask on the live chat. But finally here, a nice question, I think, actually, just to summarise and close with. Aidan asks, what are the panel's recommendations and strategies for overcoming obstacles, reluctance to embrace faith differences, especially with regards to career progression and conversations? So love to know your thoughts on Aidan's question here.
I mean, maybe I can just kick off. I think this really speaks to our earlier discussion about this idea about empathy and allyship, and not restricting that to one particular group. Because the reality is there are so many, sort of endless dimensions of diversity. And so if you take something like faith, if we have the principle of having that idea of empathy, of that idea of understanding, then that should apply also, when it comes to faith differences. Part of the challenge we have, certainly across, Europe, is our legislation around how much data we can have around some of these categories. Yeah. But, I'm a big believer in not having data doesn't mean you can't have discussions, and you can't look at it with that lens. You may not be able to do it as scientifically, but I think that's really critical to open up those conversations multidimensional.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Karina. And any final last words of thought from yourself, Sarah or Emily?
I would absolutely concur with what Karina has just said. At PwC, obviously you can't monitor this in many countries, but in the UK we can monitor faith. It's best practice to monitor the faith of our workforce, and we have 5 faith networks in the UK firm, and we bring those networks together. And one of the wonderful things that we've realised is understanding faith is a fantastic education, and an education providing different cultural insights. But when you bring faith groups together, there are so many things that combine them than separate them. They there's so much. So many values that combine the different faith groups, which is, I think, very, very reaffirming and very encouraging. So, yes, it's not easy in those territories, but I think it's absolutely right. The conversation is and the curiosity are fantastic skills to have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you ever so much. And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for before we go into our networking break. So I will just very quickly say thank you very much indeed to our fantastic diversity and inclusion panelists. You've been wonderful. Thank you ever so much.